The rain had been falling for 2 days when she found the box. The old trunk sat in the corner of a storage room behind a small museum in Normandy, its lid warped by decades of damp. The label had faded to near invisibility, just a few words left. War letters, 1940 to 45. She almost passed it by. There were so many forgotten boxes here, so many ghosts sealed in cardboard. But something about this one, the faint scent of paper and dust, the single strip of red ribbon tied around the handle, made her stop. Inside, she found letters. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, wrapped in yellowing string. Some were folded with military precision, others crumpled as if written in haste. The ink had bled into the paper in places, words smudged by water or tears. She lifted one at random, her fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. The first letter was dated June 3, 1940. The handwriting was neat, careful, unmistakably British. "My dearest Anna," it began. "We're waiting on the beach now. The sea smells of oil and smoke. You'd laugh to see us like this. Grown men sitting in the sand like schoolboys. Boots off, sharing the last of the chocolate." The writer's name was Thomas Hale, Royal Engineers, Dunkirk. He described the sound of aircraft overhead, the distant thunder of guns. "They say we'll be home soon," he wrote, "but home feels like a dream from another life. I keep thinking of your hands on the piano keys. I keep thinking I must remember that sound, because it might be the last beautiful thing I ever hear." The letter ended abruptly. Mid-sentence, the ink blotched as if something, or someone, had interrupted him. There was no next page. The next envelope she opened bore a German postmark. The script was tidy, formal, the tone restrained. "Liebste Clara," it began. "We are told that our victory here in France will be swift, but I find little joy in the word victory. Yesterday, I helped bury a French boy no older than my brother. He had been carrying a photograph of his mother, and when I placed it beside him, I thought of you." The man's name was Franz Adler, 23, from Munich. His letter ended with a simple wish. "When this is done, I hope the world remembers that we once shared the same sky." The historian set it aside, unable to breathe for a moment. It struck her that these two letters, one from each side of the same battle, could have crossed each other in the air over the Channel, written by men who might have faced one another across a rifle sight. The third letter came from somewhere farther away. North Africa, 1942. The paper was thin, brittle from heat. "Dear Mom," it began in looping American handwriting. "You'd love the sunsets here. They're the color of copper pennies, and when the wind dies, the desert hums like a beehive. We got ambushed yesterday. I won't tell you how bad it was. You'd just worry. But I'll say this. I saw one of ours give his last drink of water to a wounded German. That's the kind of thing I'll remember, not the fighting. It makes you believe we might still deserve to go home." Each letter she opened seemed to peel back another layer of the war. The part that no newsreel or history book could show. There were messages from Soviet conscripts written in pencil on scraps of newspaper, from Italian sailors describing the loneliness of the sea, from nurses in makeshift hospitals whose letters smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender. One was from a woman named Elise, a nurse in Cherbourg, to her sister. "The wounded come in every hour," she wrote. "Some still whisper for their mothers. Some just stare. I used to think courage meant not being afraid, but now I see it's something else. Courage is tying a bandage when your hands are shaking too much to hold the cloth." Another was from a Japanese pilot, written on rice paper so delicate it nearly tore in her hands. "To my father," it read, "tomorrow I fly. I have no hatred in me, only duty. I watched the sunrise this morning and thought how it must look the same over your village. When you read this, I will be part of that sky. I hope you look up and think kindly of me." The historian felt a strange weight settle in her chest as she read on. These were not words of glory or patriotism. They were small, intimate confessions, moments of fear, of love, of hope that somehow survived inside a war designed to destroy all of those things. One letter, written in pencil on U.S. Army stationery, made her pause the longest. "Dear Betty," it began, "I met a German today. Don't worry. He didn't shoot me, and I didn't shoot him. We both got lost in the fog near the forest. We stared at each other like two fools until we realized neither of us wanted to die that morning. We shared a cigarette, didn't say a word, then walked away in opposite directions. I don't even know his name, but I think I'll dream about him for the rest of my life. Isn't that strange?" The soldier signed it only as James, somewhere in Belgium. Another envelope was postmarked from Leningrad, the paper yellow and thin as onion skin. The letter was from a girl barely 20. "My dearest Misha," she wrote, "they say the cold will pass soon, but I no longer believe them. The bread is gone, and I traded my mother's ring for a handful of potatoes. But do you know what keeps me alive? The thought that you might still be out there under the same gray sky, thinking of me. If I do not live to see spring, promise me you will." The historian closed her eyes. Some of the letters were unsigned, some undelivered, some never even opened until now. She imagined the hands that had written them, calloused, trembling, dirty, young. She imagined them reaching for pens in candlelight, while mortars rumbled far away. Among the last was a single-page note from Italy, written by a German soldier to a local girl. The ink was faint, the paper folded a dozen times. "Maria," it said, "I have no right to write you, but I cannot leave without saying this. I did not choose this war, and you did not choose to see me as a man instead of an enemy. For 3 nights you brought us bread, knowing what it might cost you. I want you to know that when I close my eyes, I see your face, not the ones I've lost. Whatever becomes of me, promise me you'll forget the uniform and remember only that I loved you." The historian looked at that letter for a long time. The paper still held the faint scent of smoke and dust. She imagined Maria receiving it, or perhaps never receiving it at all, and living her whole life wondering what became of him. At the bottom of the box was one final envelope. No name, no date, only the word "home" written across it in faded ink. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was unsteady, perhaps from injury. "To whoever finds this," it began, "if this letter reaches anyone, know that I tried to do what was right. I thought war would make me brave. It only made me wish I'd written more letters. I hope the world after this is gentler than the one we knew. If someone reads this years from now, please remember us not as soldiers, but as people who once dared to love, even when everything around us was falling apart." By the time she finished reading, the rain outside had stopped. The first sunlight in days touched the floorboards, spilling gold over the table and the open box. She gathered the letters gently, one by one, and returned them to their envelope bundles. For a moment, she thought she could hear their voices, all of them, overlapping softly, carried by the faintest echo of time. That night, when the museum closed and the lights went out, the room seemed to breathe with quiet life. The letters rested in their box once more, but something about them had changed. They no longer felt forgotten, they felt remembered, and if anyone had stood in that room just then, they might have imagined the sound of 1,000 pens scratching paper, the murmur of young voices speaking across oceans and decades, a chorus of hearts that refused to be silenced. In their words lived everything war tried to destroy, and everything that somehow endured. The morning after she discovered the letters, the historian couldn't stop thinking about them. She had dreamed of the voices all night, their words echoing through her sleep. When she awoke, she still heard them, faintly, like music beneath the noise of rain. She made herself coffee, but it went cold untouched. Her thoughts circled around one idea that refused to let go. Who were they? She began with the first letter. Thomas Hale, Royal Engineers, Dunkirk. The museum's archives listed no such name among the local units, but in a database in London, she found a match. Private Thomas William Hale, service number 173048, listed as missing, presumed dead, June 4th, 1940. There was no burial record, no photograph, just the name. She read his letter again, the one to Anna where he wrote about the piano and the chocolate. This time she noticed a faint pencil mark at the edge of the page, a note written sideways. "Anna, if you ever read this, I made it to the boat." The historian's breath caught. He had lived long enough to write that line. But did he survive the crossing? In her mind, she saw him. A young man in wet uniform, trudging through sand under a sky dark with smoke. The beach at Dunkirk stretched endless and gray. Men huddled in lines, their faces caked with salt. Thomas sat with his boots off, trying to dry his socks, writing by the light of a burning truck. Every few seconds, he looked up at the sky, waiting for the sound of engines. When it came, the roar of Stukas diving, he dropped the letter into his coat and ran. He made it to the water's edge, his letter soaked, his rifle lost. A soldier beside him screamed for help, and Thomas turned, hauling him onto a half-sunk boat. They were both shaking, but alive. The letter pressed against his chest, smudging against his skin. In the chaos, he never finished the sentence. The next morning, a trawler took him aboard. The next morning, a trawler took him aboard. For 2 days, they drifted toward England, dodging wreckage and bodies. Thomas never wrote again. The historian searched, but found no second letter, no family trace. Anna might never have known he'd survived the beach, if only for a little while. The second letter haunted her differently. Franz Adler, the German officer who buried the French boy. His handwriting was beautiful, elegant, steady. There was something tender about it that didn't match the image of the war she'd grown up with. She typed his name into an old registry, and after hours of searching, she found a single entry. Gefreiter Franz Adler, 7th Panzer Division, reported missing in Russia. 1943, Russia. She pictured him standing in snow up to his knees, fingers cracked and bleeding. Around him, the endless white silence of the Eastern Front. He would have been 26 then. His letter to Clara had been written in 1940, when he still believed in an ending. In her imagination, she saw him by a campfire somewhere near Smolensk, his uniform stiff with frost, his boots steaming as he held his hands to the flame. He pulled a photograph from his pocket. A girl with dark hair, smiling shyly at the camera. Clara. He smiled back at the picture and whispered her name. Around him, men muttered in their sleep. The fire popped, and snow began to fall again. He took out his notebook, its corners burned from the march, and began to write his final letter. Liebste Clara, if you receive this, know that the snow is falling again. It is beautiful in a way that breaks the heart. I think often of the river near your house, how it must look in summer. We fight for days now without moving, without warmth. I no longer believe in victory, only in you. When I close my eyes, I dream of the sun. He folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and fell asleep for the last time. The letter was found by another soldier and sent home, but the envelope never reached its destination. It ended up in the same box half a century later, waiting for someone to read it. The historian set it aside with trembling hands. Each letter she opened was becoming less a piece of paper and more a door. The one from North Africa came next, the American boy who wrote about the sunsets. His name was Corporal Jack Turner, 2nd Armored Division. His unit records placed him at Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The historian read his words again. The sunsets are the color of copper pennies. She could almost see it. The desert stretching out like the surface of another planet. The sand glowing orange under the dying sun. Jack was 19. He wrote to his mother every week, though only a handful of letters survived. One, sent days before his final battle, read simply, "I think I'm getting used to being scared." It's strange, but after a while you stop shaking. You just start hoping that whatever happens, someone will remember who you were. She pictured him crouched behind a half-buried tank, the sound of engines echoing through the dunes. His canteen was empty, his uniform stiff with sweat and sand. He held a photograph of his mother, smiling on the porch of their farmhouse in Kansas, and tucked it inside his helmet for luck. When the shells began to fall, he didn't move. He looked once at the horizon, at that copper sky he loved, and whispered, "Beautiful, isn't it?" His body was never recovered. The historian wiped her eyes before she realized she was crying. Later that evening, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat at her desk surrounded by the letters, her computer screen glowing pale in the dark. She opened one of the nurse's letters again. Elise, from Cherbourg. The handwriting trembled slightly, the ink thin, as if written late at night. In her mind, Elise was young, perhaps 24, her hair tied back under a cap, her hands raw from washing bandages. The hospital smelled of carbolic acid and candle wax. She had written the letter while sitting by the window, listening to bombs in the distance. Today, a boy woke from surgery and asked if he still had both legs. I told him yes, because I could not bear to tell him no. Perhaps that is a sin, but if lying can save a soul, then perhaps God will forgive me. The historian imagined her finishing the letter, blowing out the candle, and lying down on the cot for a few hours of restless sleep, before rising again to another endless day. Every letter was a heartbeat, every name a world. By midnight, she had read 30 of them, each one its own tiny universe of sorrow and tenderness. She realized that none of these letters spoke of hatred. Not one. They spoke of longing, of faith, of wanting to live. As she reached for another envelope, her eyes fell on the last one, the unsigned message addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." The ink shimmered faintly in the lamplight. She read it again, slowly this time, letting each word sink in. "Please remember us not as soldiers, but as people who once dared to love." She sat there for a long time, the room utterly still. Somewhere outside, an owl called, and the sea murmured beyond the cliffs. For the first time, she understood that these weren't just letters from the dead. They were conversations left unfinished. And now, somehow, she had become their last listener. The next morning dawned cold and clear. The historian sat in her small apartment above the museum, staring at the sea through the window. The water was calm, but she couldn't stop thinking of Thomas Hale and the thousands like him who had crossed that same channel 85 years ago, leaving pieces of themselves behind in the surf. She decided to go, not for the museum, not even for history, but for them, for the voices that had trusted paper and ink to carry what their lives could not. Her first stop was Dunkirk. The beach stretched wide and flat beneath a low gray sky, the tide pulling back in slow breaths. She walked where the waves met the sand, the wind biting through her coat. Tourists came here sometimes, but that morning it was empty except for her and a few seagulls. She knelt near the water's edge and closed her eyes. She imagined Thomas Hale sitting in the same spot, his boots off, the sound of distant gunfire rolling over the horizon. He had written of the piano, of Anna's hands on the keys. Somewhere back in England, she might have played that song one last time, not knowing he was listening in his mind while the world burned around him. The historian pulled a single white carnation from her coat pocket and placed it in the sand. The petals trembled in the wind, then settled. She whispered his name, Thomas, just to make it real again. From Dunkirk, she traveled to Munich, following the trail of Franz Adler. The city had rebuilt itself so beautifully that it was almost hard to imagine it once lay in ruins. But when she walked along the old riverbank where Franz had grown up, the echoes were there, faint but alive. She found a small public archive where an elderly woman helped her search the Adler family records. There was one surviving relative, a granddaughter. Her name was Greta. They met in a small cafe near Sendlinger Tor. Greta was in her 70s, her eyes soft and curious. When the historian showed her the letter, Greta held it with both hands, as though afraid it might vanish. "My grandfather," she said, tears forming. "We never knew what became of him. My mother was only a baby when he went to the front." The historian translated the letter aloud, the cafe quiet around them. Franz's words, "When I close my eyes, I dream of the sun," filled the air like a prayer. Greta smiled through tears. "He was a kind man," they said. "I think he would be glad someone remembered." That night, as she left the cafe, snow began to fall, slow and silent, like the world holding its breath. She thought of Franz writing in the Russian winter, his fingers stiff with cold. Now, all these years later, his words had come home. Her next journey took her south, across the Mediterranean, to Tunisia. She wanted to see the desert where Jack Turner had written about sunsets and copper skies. The heat was fierce, even in winter. The sand shimmered like gold dust, and the air trembled above the dunes. A local guide took her to the old Kasserine Pass battlefield. Now nothing more than scattered stones and the remains of trenches half swallowed by time. She stood at the ridge as the sun dipped low, staining the horizon in bronze and red. It was exactly as Jack had described it. The desert seemed endless, vast, indifferent, yet achingly beautiful. She imagined him there, 19 years old, watching the same sunset, writing to a mother who never stopped waiting for a letter that would never come. She took his letter from her pocket and read it aloud. The words drifted into the hot wind and vanished across the sands. For a moment, she thought she could hear his voice. Young, hopeful, still in love with the world despite everything. When she returned to Europe, she went next to Cherbourg to find the hospital where Elise had written her letters. The old stone building still stood, though it was now a school. The nurses' quarters had become classrooms, but the windows were the same, tall, narrow, letting in the soft gray light of Normandy mornings. She stood by one of those windows, looking out at the harbor, and imagined Elise sitting in that very spot with a pen in hand, writing by candlelight while the guns rumbled miles away. She could almost hear her whispering the words as she wrote them. "Courage is tying a bandage when your hands are shaking too much to hold the cloth." The historian found no record of Elise's fate, but the school principal told her that after the war, local children often found old letters hidden under floorboards when the building was repaired, many written by nurses to their families. Perhaps Elise's letter had been one of them, carried away by someone who couldn't bear to throw it out. She placed a small candle on the windowsill before she left. It flickered gently, casting light across the old stone walls. As she traveled, something began to change in her. The letters no longer felt like relics of the past. They felt like living voices, still moving through the world. Each one she read seemed to lead her closer to something larger, something she couldn't yet name. In the evenings, she reread the last anonymous letter, the one that said, "Please remember us not as soldiers, but as people who once dared to love." Those words had become her compass. In Italy, she followed the trace of the German soldier who wrote to the girl named Maria. The town was small, perched on a hill above olive groves. She found the church mentioned in his note. The same place, perhaps, where Maria had once knelt to pray. The priest was an old man with kind eyes. When she showed him the letter, he nodded slowly. "There was a woman named Maria," he said. "She died not long ago. She never married, but every year she came here on the same day. the anniversary of the soldiers leaving the town. She'd sit in that pew for hours and never say a word. The historian looked at the pew he pointed to. Sunlight fell across it through the stained glass, scattering color over the wood. She set the letter down on the seat and whispered, "He loved you." The priest smiled gently. I think she always knew. Outside, the church bells began to ring, slow and deep. For a moment, it was as though time folded, and she could almost see them. Maria, young and terrified, handing a loaf of bread to a uniformed stranger who looked at her with the same fear and tenderness. Two people who should have been enemies, bound forever by one brief act of mercy. The historian left the church in silence. The air smelled of rain and olive trees. By the time she returned to Normandy, she had visited 5 countries, crossed 3 seas, and read more than 100 letters. Her notebook was full of names, dates, and small details: piano keys, copper skies, snowflakes, candles. But one evening, as she unpacked, she noticed something she hadn't before. Beneath the old envelopes, at the very bottom of the trunk, was a folded map, yellowed and fragile. Across it, in faded pencil, someone had drawn a line connecting each of the very places she had just visited: Dunkirk, Munich, Kasserine, Cherbourg, and a small village in Italy. At the end of the line, written in careful English script, was a single word: home. Her breath caught. Whoever had assembled the letters had already traced this same path. Long before her, perhaps another historian, perhaps a soldier who collected them to keep the memories alive. That night, she sat at her desk, surrounded by the letters, the map before her. For the first time, she felt she understood what they were trying to say. That history is not dates and battles, but voices. Voices trying to find their way home. She picked up her pen and began to write. To whoever reads this in years to come, she wrote, I found your letters. I walked the roads you walked, stood where you fell, saw the sunsets you described. The world you fought for still stands, flawed, scarred, but alive. And though time has buried your names, your words have not been lost. They still speak, still reach across oceans of silence. You are remembered. As she wrote the last line, the wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the windows. The candle flickered, and for an instant she thought she saw movement. Shadows forming shapes on the wall. Faint outlines of figures in old uniforms, watching quietly. Then the wind fell still again. The room was silent. But she felt them there somehow. Thomas, Franz, Jack, Elise, Maria, and all the others. Not ghosts, not memories, just people. People who once dared to love, and who, through their letters, had finally found their way home. Spring came slowly to Normandy. The fields around the museum turned green again. The sea brightened to silver in the mornings, and the air began to smell faintly of salt and blossoms. The historian spent her days at a long wooden table surrounded by the letters. She scanned them carefully, typed translations, cross-referenced names and regiments, piecing together fragments of lives that had once intersected in war. At first, she told no one. The work felt private, sacred, like tending to graves. But as she read more, she realized these voices weren't meant to stay buried. They were written to be heard, so she began to assemble them into a single book. She called it Letters from the Silence. Each chapter began with a letter and the small story she'd uncovered behind it. Thomas Hale and Anna, the piano and the beach, Franz Adler in the snow, writing to Clara about the sun, Jack Turner and the copper desert sky, Elise tying bandages with trembling hands, Maria and the soldier who had no right to love her, yet did anyway. She wrote not as a scholar, but as a witness. The letters guided her hand more than any archive or record. They seemed to whisper what they wanted said, words that had waited too long to be spoken aloud. When the manuscript was finished, She sent it to a publisher in London who specialized in historical memoirs. Weeks passed with no reply. She almost forgot about it, busying herself with cataloging the museum's exhibits. Then one morning, an email arrived. "We read your manuscript. It's extraordinary. We would be honored to publish it." She sat there staring at the screen, heart pounding. For the first time, she realized that the voices in the box would finally reach the world beyond her small desk and the whispering sea. Months later, the book was printed. The cover was simple: a black-and-white photograph of folded letters bound with string. Inside, her introduction read, "These are not the stories of heroes, but of human beings who remembered how to love when the world forgot." When the book was released, something unexpected began to happen. Letters started arriving at the museum, not from the past this time, but from the living. A man from Kent wrote that his grandmother's name had been Anna Hale. She had kept a photograph of a young soldier named Thomas on her piano until the day she died. She never spoke of him, only played the same song every year on June 4th. Another came from Germany, a woman who had found her grandfather's name, Franz Adler, in the book. She said her family had always wondered why he never came home, and now they knew. She enclosed a picture: Franz and Clara on a park bench, smiling in the sun. From America came a letter in careful cursive. "My name is William Turner. Jack Turner was my great-uncle. My family never knew he wrote letters like that. Thank you for giving us a part of him we never had." Even a letter from Japan arrived, written in soft brush strokes. "My grandfather was the pilot you mention. His letter has been in our family for decades, but we never knew anyone else had read it. Thank you for letting him fly again in the hearts of others." The historian read them all, tears welling each time. Across languages, borders, and generations, the letters had begun to stitch the world back together in small, invisible ways. One evening, she was invited to speak at a memorial event in London. The hall was filled with veterans' families, students, and quiet faces holding photographs. On the stage beside her was a single glass case containing the original letters, the same ones that had slept in darkness for decades. She stepped to the podium, her hands trembling slightly, and looked out at the crowd. "These letters," she began, "were never meant to be history. They were simply words written by frightened, hopeful people who wanted to be remembered. Not for their uniforms, but for their hearts." She paused, then added softly, "I think, in the end, that's what all of us want." Afterward, people came to speak with her. Some carried old envelopes of their own. Others simply wanted to touch the glass of the case, as though reaching across time. One woman, frail, with silver hair and kind eyes, pressed a folded note into her hand and whispered, "This was my father's. He never made it home. Maybe you'll know what to do with it." When the hall emptied, the historian sat alone for a long while, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city. She unfolded the note. It was written in faded pencil. "If anyone finds this, tell my little girl I'm not afraid. Tell her I'll be waiting for her laugh." She folded it again, carefully, and placed it with the others. That night, back in her apartment, she sat by the open window, the sea murmuring below. The wind fluttered the curtains, scattering papers across her desk. The letters shifted slightly, as if stirred by unseen hands. She smiled through her tears. In the silence that followed, she could almost hear them. Hundreds of voices, not in sorrow, but in peace. They had been found. They had been read. Years later, when she retired, the letters remained in the museum's permanent collection. Visitors from around the world came to see them, not for the battles they described, but for the small, ordinary beauty inside each line. A child's name, a song, the color of a sunset, the promise of return. Every year, on the anniversary of the book's publication, she returned to the museum. She would walk down the hallway lined with glass cases, Stop before the letters and whisper the same words she'd written all those years ago. Please remember them not as soldiers, but as people who once dared to love. And as the light from the window touched the fragile paper, the ink seemed to glow faintly, as if the letters themselves were breathing again, alive in the quiet air. Because they were. Because they always would be.